SMSL's SP200 headphone amp uses THX AAA headphone amp technology, yet it's $110 cheaper than Drop's own THX AAA amp. So how well does the SMSL SP200 perform, and how does it compare with amps around its kind of price range, such as Schiit Audio's Asgard 3 and Drop's own THX AAA amp? That's what I aim to find out. To start with, the SP200 is actually quite a small amp. If you compare it to the size of the Drop THX AAA 789 and the Asgard 3, it's considerably smaller. Now, one thing to note is that it's actually a single-ended amp. It's not balanced, despite the fact that you can see on the back here it has balanced inputs and what looks like a balanced output, actually just 4-pin XLR. The actual circuit itself is only single-ended. So that means if you do have something like a balanced stack and you use the balanced inputs, this will be converted to single-ended inside the amp before it's amplified. Now, compared to the Drop THX 789, which is balanced inside, although it does initially for the feedback circuit get converted to single-ended, also the Drop, even though it has space for a power supply, does use a wall wart, and the Asgard 3 has large transformer inside and a full power supply inside. This has a small compact power supply inside the case. So there's a little bit of a different setup compared to the others. However, it is convenient if you do have a pair of headphones that does has a 4-pin XLR connector that you can connect it here, and if you do have a DAC with balanced outputs, you can connect them. I wouldn't fuss too much over, whether using balanced or single-ended, although there's less conversion using the RCA single-ended inputs. Now, a question I get asked sometimes is, can you use these with something like a portable player or phone that has an analog output? And yes, you can. So if you do have another device with an analog output, like a 3.5mm jack, you can use a cable to convert that to RCA. It's the same kind of signal that's being sent out from the 3.5mm socket as is received through the single-ended RCA jacks on the back. For the output as well as the 4-pin XLR connector, you have a 6.3mm jack. Now, if you have something with a 3.5mm connector, what you call a 1/4-inch jack in some countries, you can just use any kind of regular adapter and plug it in there to adapt to those headphones. So no problem there. Likewise, if you have unusually, a 4.4mm connector, which I again hope will become standard, you can get various adapter cables to adapt them to 4-pin XLR or 6.3mm. So in that, you also have, as well as your power switch on the front, you have your selector to choose between XLR and RCA, so you can have two devices connected and switch between them. Say if you had like connecting a computer and then connecting a DAC for things like maybe if you wanted to use it in a gaming setup as well as a music setup. And you also have a high and a low gain. One thing I did notice about the gain, though, that even on low gain, it didn't give you a kind of low enough gain to get much volume control for in-ear monitors. And if you have very sensitive in-ear monitors like the Andromedas, it's kind of very close to zero. But it did have a kind of minimum of hiss for IEMs, except maybe for the Andromedas, but it was actually usable if you ignore the fact that you just don't have much ability to control the volume. One problem that can cause is that a lot of the cheap volume controls that are used in inexpensive amps, down towards the very beginning of the volume adjustment and towards the very end, they lose balance. So the kind of accuracy, they're most accurate kind of in the mid-range of the where they turn, but at the very beginning they send one channel comes in first before the other. So your mileage may vary. Sometimes you get lucky and you get one which has a good volume control that is kind of fairly accurate down the bottom, and sometimes you get ones which you like, okay, the left channel comes in first, then the right kind of thing. So it didn't make the SP200 the best choice for using with in-ear monitors. However, headphones was another matter altogether. With around 6 watts maximum of output at about 16 ohms and about 3 watts at about 32 ohms, and 32 ohms kind of being the most common, it drove headphones really, really well. So I had no trouble I did experimentally connect the Susvaras to it, and it actually could drive the Susvaras, albeit not the most ideal choice for a $6,000 pair of very insensitive headphones. But it did actually behave in a very kind of, I suppose, linear way, and when it managed to drive them actually pretty well, which was pretty surprising for a little diminutive amp such as this. But it shows that you don't need balance to drive even difficult headphones. balanced is more like a design choice, whereas some manufacturers prefer to have a balanced circuit and some manufacturers prefer to work on single-ended. As you can see, in things like measurements, it doesn't necessarily improve the measurements to have balanced or single-ended. It can actually make them worse because you need to double the components, and any mismatch between the components will increase distortion and negate some of the effects. But as things go, I wouldn't fuss too much over whether something is balanced or single-ended. Originally, it was beneficial in some designs to have balance so you had more power, but with the very large variety of electronics available to manufacturers and competent engineers who can design good electrical circuits, you can get plenty of power out of a design, whether it's balanced or single-ended, and it's not something I would kind of worry about too much. In terms of how it sounded actually very typical of THX amps, kind of very clean, very clear sound. So there was a sense of kind of, I suppose you can't really say that an amp truly is colorless because it doesn't color the sound in some way. But in probably the sense of it not coloring the music came through very strongly with the SP200. Whether I used things like the Drop Sennheiser HD6XX, which is one of the most common headphones among starting enthusiasts nowadays. Hi-Fi Man Sundaras, which are very good value planar headphone and pretty revealing of the quality of amps and other components, considering they're only around $350. And a variety of other headphones, such as the expensive headphones I have sitting around here, like just to test, I did Focal's Utopias and Meze Empyreans and those kinds of things. But in general, it was the impression that I could hear clearly, the quality of the DAC or source I was using very clearly. Music came through with a kind of sense of clarity, like I was hearing what was going on in the music. You didn't have any sense like, some tube amps sound warm and bloomy. Some other kind of amps have their own slight tuning. But there was none of that sense with the SP200. It just had a feeling like, okay, this is what the music is. And that, it immediately I thought, oh, well, okay, there's something to this THX design. It does give you that clean and clear sound, and uncolored sound, and especially, of course, if you do consider measurements important, although I don't consider them as really relating to very directly to how we perceive, when we listen to music. Some people do it, appreciate the fact that it does measure very well. It was only really in comparison to other amps where things, I say comparisons are evil. I mean, on its own, if someone bought this and bought a DAC of their choice, I think they find it very, very enjoyable because of the way it just very cleanly drove headphones, whether they're high impedance headphones like the Sennheisers or low impedance planars. It did a really good job. But when you compare with other amps, you start to notice, well, something sounds a little bit better from this amp on this track and that amp on that track. And that was much the case with the SP200. For example, the Asgard 3, while it's kind of cheaper, there was a situation which, if you weren't already aware, that the original, the previous Asgard 2 was around $200 without a DAC module installed and is stayed at $200, even though Schiit has upgraded the power supply, have kept the price low and kind of taken the hit on that, even though because Jason Stoddard, when he was testing power supplies, the power supply that would be most suitable for a $200 amp didn't sound as good, so he went for the better one and said, well, I'll just take the price hit. And that's made the Asgard 3 a really good bargain in terms of the sound quality you get. But it's interesting comparing both of these because the Asgard 3, to me, sounded a little bit kind of warmer and bloomier than the SP200, which sounded kind of that clean, clear, especially in the treble, you kind of notice it being more open and clear sounding, whereas the Asgard 3 was maybe just this touch sense of being slightly warmer. And if you're wondering about these comparisons, I did level match them to within 0.1 decibels to ensure that I at least had some accuracy there before switching between either of them. To compare these amps, one of the albums I used was from the Seed Ensemble. It was an album called Drift Glass, and I was kind of just in a random album that I found someone was discussing on forums. And in comparing both the amps, I was listening to the way instruments were presented through various headphones, and I noticed that maybe, in a sense, the SP200 kind of things like drum impact sounded a little bit flat. I'm used to listening to drum impact through a lot of different music, and it's interesting to hear how the presentation comes through different headphones and amps. And so, but when I listened to the Asgard 3, I felt that drum impacts came through better through the Asgard 3 than with the SP200. And then listening to the track and listening to how deep the sound was, how deep the sense of soundstage was, I felt that the SP200 was maybe a bit flatter sounding than the Asgard 3, which seemed to give a better sense of depth to the sound. Now, on the other hand, of course, the SP200 sounded kind of a little bit cleaner and clearer in some respects, but it didn't sound kind of as, even though the Asgard 3 I could say sounded maybe a touch warmer in comparison, it sounded a little bit kind of deeper and wider in the way it presented stuff. So I think possibly, the fact that it's got a full-size transformer and a very good power supply in here is to the Asgard's advantage here, whereas the SMSL, I don't know exactly what kind of power supply it has inside, but it is pretty small. The SP200 does use the THX amp circuit. Now, what does that do? Now, the AAA amp circuit is interesting. It does refer to how distortion is lowered in the design. Now, in a normal amp, you have an amplification circuit, and it takes a signal and mixes it with the power from the power supply and then sends out a larger version of that signal. Now, what manufacturers do to lower distortion is they use a thing called negative feedback. And that is literally a direct connection from more or less the output back to the input. I mean, there are different kinds of negative feedback, so I'm oversimplifying this, but maybe in part of an amplification circuit or the full amplification circuit, you will have a line going back, which through some adjustment will compare, compares the input signal to the output signal and adjusts for any distortion that occurs when the signal is amplified. And this is because all components add a tiny bit of distortion or to the sound. And so some compensation can be helpful. Some manufacturers don't like this at all. They prefer to focus on maybe high quality, accurate components to ensure that a minimum distortion goes through. It's a design choice. Now, the THX amps use a active feedback circuit. So what happens is on the feedback line, it actually has a little amplifier, and that little amplifier will amplifies against the distortion between the output and the input, lowering the distortion very considerably. However, it's kind of like getting a car and adding kind of active suspension and a whole bunch of active drive control and all that kind of thing, like they have in, say, old Formula One cars used to have, but without upgrading the engine. Now, the engine in an amp is essentially the power supply. If the power supply is very minimal, and we've seen, various amps such as the THX amps, which from the Drop THX amp, which has a wall wart, and that's kind of its power supply, plus there's a bit of a power supply inside. That is a kind of limiting factor to how well they can perform, regardless of how low their distortion is. It's kind of like saying, well, it doesn't matter how well a car performs if the engine isn't up to scratch. And it's very much that kind of situation. Now, of course, different engineers have different ideas about how these things work. But I still have to say, the big, heavy power supplied amps with very comprehensive designs seem to still perform better. But even if they don't get quite the measurements on distortion, that's probably because measurements are tones and sweeps, and they're measuring the difference between, a tone's input and output, and that. When you're playing back music, you've got a signal which is changing rapidly, and that can affect the circuit in different ways which don't show up on regular measurements. Anyway, so that's why I think that maybe the SP200 had maybe a bit of a flatter presentation, even if it did sound in some respects cleaner and clearer than the Asgard 3, which kind of gave more kind of better drum impacts and better depth. I'm taking a guess that's to do with the power supply. Also, compared to the Drop THX amp, now the Drop THX amp is $110 more expensive, and that's a very large amount more expensive when you're down at this price range. For me, who's spent thousands of dollars on gear, it doesn't sound $110 more doesn't seem like that much. But if you're a person on a budget, obviously, and you're choosing between spending $289 and spending $400, that's a big difference. So in that, comparing both of them level match was very hard. It was very close. So breaking out, the expensive headphones to compare, the differences I'm going to tell you about are very, very fine, and something that I think a lot of people listening to a lot of normal music would not notice. So those differences were, I did feel like there was a better sense of depth, a better sense of clarity on the nuances in instruments when I listened to the Drop THX amp. More detail coming through when I listen very carefully. Now, again, this is from listening very carefully and probably like listening casually. If I did an A/B, I probably wouldn't notice the difference. So that's the kind of fine difference you have there. But all the same, it left the SP200 in this interesting gap between the Asgard 3 and the THX amp. If you don't need the IEM performance capabilities of the THX amp, because it does have 3 gain stages and it does have a dedicated 3.5mm socket, But if you're listening with full-sized headphones and you want a very good value, very clean sounding and very well measuring, powerful amp that will work with any full-sized headphones quite well, I think the SP200 does a really good job. It's still a really nice amp, and it is in a very crowded market. I suppose it just depends very much on the what you're after in terms of design. Maybe you have a matching DAC that you want to use it with. There are quite a few out there with kind of similar price range. And for that, I think it would do really well. I was using this primarily with things like a Schiit Audio Yggdrasil or a Schiit Audio Bifrost or a Chord Hugo 2, stuff that's way more expensive than the SP200. And so a lot of these differences and subtleties I talk about in comparing the amps were kind of really nitpicking. So that's kind of the SP200, and I'd say as an amp, yeah, it's a nice little bargain. And for people for whom the features, good power, good headphone drive really appeal, and they like the really excellent, clean sounding and well measuring specs, then definitely consider the SP200 as an amp to buy. So I'd like to thank SMSL for sending me this amp, and thanks to everyone who requested that I review it, actually, because it's been interesting to see how well an amp that's designed to measure really well as its primary goal does perform. So I hope you did like my video on the SP200. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you'd like to be notified when I have videos coming out. Also, thanks to all the people who supported making these videos. Because of these people, I've been able to continue making these videos. If you'd like to become a supporter, get my buying advice anytime, see these videos in advance, get my early listening impressions, and chat with me online, do consider becoming a supporter. It's like buying me a coffee once in a while. And it probably, if you, in terms of the advice you can get, it might actually save you way more than that, and if you save you from buying the wrong thing. So I hope you enjoyed my videos, and thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you online.